Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Grooming for the Purposes of Exploitation and Abuse, What Caregivers and Educators Should Know. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted today. If you have any questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar. The chat box is also available if you have any comments or technical support questions during the presentation. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute website and will be emailed to you in the coming days. My name is Jasmine. I'm the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. The Prevention Institute is a provincial nonprofit organization that is located in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 lands and the homeland of the Métis. We affirm our commitment to reconciliation through our work with the communities we serve. Our organizational focus is to help all children thrive through primary prevention and the promotion of well-being. We aim to raise awareness, build capacity, and respond to emerging trends by providing training, information, and resources based on current evidence. We believe that all children, regardless of ability, have the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. We work in a variety of areas, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention, maternal and infant health, early childhood mental health, child injury prevention, child traffic safety, parenting, and sexual and reproductive health. One focus of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program is to provide evidence-based information on topics related to youth sexual health that is accessible to health educators and caregivers. Understanding the concept of grooming, as well as evidence-based strategies for prevention and interventions, is crucial for a collective upstream approach to mitigate child abuse and exploitation in our communities. Here to speak on this topic today is Dr. Lindsay Williamson. Dr. Lindsay is dedicated to helping people improve their relationships with humans and animals. At present, she is a Canadian Institutes of Health Research funded postdoctoral researcher and credentialed evaluator who examines various aspects of human-animal interactions. Lindsay has conducted research on abortion, sexual consent, the #MeToo movement, infertility, feminist identification, and sex education, which have been published in the Canadian Journal of Sexual Health, Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology Canada, and the Journal of Reproductive and Infant Psychology. Her contributions to the sexual health community have included volunteering with Planned Parenthood Waterloo, now the Shore Centre, Planned Parenthood Toronto, Saskatoon Sexual Health, Saskatoon Sexual Assault and Information Centre, and the Nest Creek Music Festival's Safe Nest, Safe Haven. In addition, Lindsay served as interim executive director and board member for Saskatoon Sexual Health. She has also taught human sexuality for the Department of Psychology at the University of Saskatchewan. As a consultant for the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute since 2014, Lindsay has produced over 15 technical reports and helped establish the adolescent sexual health community of practice. Outside of research, evaluation, and teaching, Lindsay trains her beloved Australian cattle dog, Steve Irwin. Lindsay, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jasmine. Really appreciate it. So I'll share my screen here. All right. So yes, lots to cover today. I definitely want to focus on some highlights, definitely want to of the literature review that I completed, and I definitely want to leave some time for questions as well. So I will try to wrap this up in an hour and then leave about a half hour for questions. So yeah, but feel free, I mean, save your questions for the end or put them in the, the chat or the Q&A as we go along. And yeah, let's get started then. There we go. So I like to situate myself a little bit. I think this is really important to help be very transparent about where I was coming from in terms of, collecting this information and putting it together for you. And I think that as people getting this information, you need to know who I am as well to help understand, how to absorb it and how to think about it in different ways, critically or positively. And I invite you, if there's anything that, you recognize that maybe I haven't highlighted or something that you would like a little bit more about, yeah, please do let me know. I'm very open to getting more input. And I'm a lifelong student, so always learning, always hungry for more information. But yeah, this is, a little bit, in terms of who I am, some of my values as well. And I definitely, these change over time as well as I grow and change as a human. But I think that these all absolutely inform my perspective of the various topics that I cover. And I know in my bio, there's definitely a lot of emphasis on, human sexuality. And that's definitely an area that is so near and dear to my heart, because for me, helping people have healthy relationships is everything. It's just such a huge part of our lives. And now I've been moving more into the world of the human animal bond. And again, it's about relationships, right? So whether we're having relationships with humans or we're having relationships and connections with animals, these are all relate back to our well-being and our happiness in this world. So yeah, so in a lot of ways, it's very, very good complement together. So the literature, or the presentation today, is based off of a literature review that I conducted for the Prevention Institute. And so that was something I was working on last year, and we published it earlier this year. So this is available on the Prevention Institute's website for you to download. And I'll mention some other resources as well as we go through here. But if you want the, the full, the full version, definitely check out the literature review. But the presentation today is going to give you a snapshot, and it'll really bring to light a lot of the highlights within the presentation. Okay, just wanted to double check the chat there. Perfect. So in terms of what I'd like to focus on today, I really want everybody to go away with an understanding of what grooming is and how important this topic is as well. And I would like people to be able to, recognize some of the risk factors and also understand, the consequences and just how important. And again, I think this relates to the importance of the issue is the consequences can be quite far reaching. And in terms of, takeaways, I really want people to recognize how to identify what grooming is, but as you'll come to understand, it's not very straightforward. So that's no fault of anybody's, that's just the nature of this topic and this issue. So I definitely want to provide some tools so that you can be as prepared and as armed as possible. And definitely we'll highlight some places for prevention and intervention within the home and within schools as well. So starting off, what is grooming? Well, grooming is really an activity that takes place generally within, the context or in the pursuit of, abusing or exploiting children or teens or adolescents. I might use a broader term like youth, but it's definitely geared towards individuals that are underage, so younger than 18. But honestly, grooming is something that can take place in all walks of life. It's, I've definitely seen instances of grooming take place within adult relationships as well. So it's by no means just limited to the youth population. It definitely can take place in other circumstances as well. But essentially, grooming is a preparatory process. It's something that prepares. It's something that comes before people are exploited or abused. And with grooming, even though the children or the youth are generally the main target, other groups surrounding the children can be targeted as well and become a part of that grooming process. So that might be, grooming a child's parents, and it might also be around, their other caregivers, so teachers or daycare workers or anything like that. But it's generally, and it can also be grooming the environment. So tailoring the environment to, be a certain way to make youth less, I guess, suspicious, and to make them feel more comfortable as well. And the general goals or kind of pursuit with the grooming is really about gaining access to the children. So sometimes, it might not be, an individual who's grooming might not automatically be able to access children. So their processes might be really geared towards getting that access. It also involves trying to get the youth and the people around them to be compliant with behavior as well. Big part of this is keeping secrets. So making sure that the groomer is not found out, and that everybody that's involved is not really suspecting of what's happening. And they really want to maintain that secrecy and not be revealed. So a lot of the behaviors that are engaged within this process, they're really directed towards that secrecy and trying to ensure that they're not being found out. And these behaviors can take place both in the real world, and now as technology is developing more and more, we're seeing these behaviors take place online as well. In terms of understanding how prevalent of an issue this is, it's really challenging. And I come back to that point about this being about secrecy and about, keeping things very hidden. And the other part is that not all grooming necessarily leads to exploitation or abuse. And so in that way, the information, people might not really recognize the behavior as grooming because that abuse and that exploitation didn't take place subsequently. The other thing is that grooming can often mimic other types of behavior that adults will engage in with children. And finally, this is an under-researched topic in a lot of ways. So I've definitely pulled together a lot of, within this literature review and this presentation, I've gathered for you as much as is out there, but this is definitely an area where more research is needed, especially when it comes to different prevention and intervention protocols or programs. But in terms of our best estimates that we have, about 50% of all cases of child sexual abuse or exploitation has involved some type of grooming beforehand. So that tells you that this is, it's a pretty common practice. It also tells you it's an effective practice. So that's something for us to keep in mind. And in terms of, the amount of youth, I mean, the estimates vary depending on the population and depending on when prevalence rates are being measured. But generally within the age range of 10 to 17, yeah, anywhere from 5 to 24%. But again, it's really hard to say if those are very accurate and true numbers, but it's kind of the best we have. We also know that a lot of that, the majority of the grooming behavior that takes place or might start in person or in the real world can continue into the online realm. So there is this kind of transition of it occurring in both places. And again, that's because of the nature of the online world. And that's something I really talked a lot about in a previous webinar on youth sexting. So highly recommend going back to that presentation and to those resources that were developed, but I'll talk a little bit more about that stuff here. And we know that, again, as the literature is coming out related to online grooming, yes, it is taking place quite a bit among this population as well. So I want you to take a look at this list, and I want you to go through it and think to yourself, how many of these have you engaged in with a child? And that can be your own child. It could be the children of your close friends or your family members. It could be children that you teach or have cared for in different ways. But just reflect on this for a moment and realize that these are behaviors that in a lot of ways, are expected. They're normalized. they are also ways to feel connected, so I know, for example, having secrets can be kind of fun, but in a way that you don't want the child to feel like they can't go and tell their parents. So I'll give you an example, a recent one for me. I was babysitting my really good friend's daughter. She's almost 5, and this was a couple weeks ago, and I had bubbles and she was obsessed with them. And at one point we decided to use the bubbles in the kitchen. And this was supposed to be not allowed. The parents, her parents would not be okay with us having bubbles in the kitchen. But we had the best time. We were blowing the bubbles and then we were cleaning up the floor as we went along. And she kept saying to me, "Oh, this is our little secret. We won't tell mom and dad." And I just, and it was fun. It was cute, and it was innocent, right? We weren't doing anything dangerous. We were just having fun. And I ended up telling her parents, and I said, "She's probably going to tell you that we did this naughty thing that we weren't supposed to, but I'm telling you now that we did this." So I was very transparent with her parents about what took place. And she ended up telling her parents later that night too. She was so excited that she had this secret. She had this like fun little thing that her and I did together that normally she's not allowed to do. Right. So that's an example that that came to mind, where I was just like, wow, I don't want to encourage her to have secrets that she doesn't tell her parents. But I also know that having that secret bonded us in a way too. So in terms of reflecting on how that point of connection or that strategy for connection could be used against children, I mean, it's really alarming in a lot of ways. So I think that, as people who are interacting with young children, it's very important for us to keep all of this in mind and to balance what we want to teach them ultimately. So yes, having secrets, doing silly things together, super fun, but we also want to make sure, or at least in that situation or that example I provided, I wanted to make sure that like her parents weren't thinking that we were having secrets that we weren't willing to share with them or bring them in on the secret together, because I think that gives them a sense of comfort, and they liked it. They loved that, we had that little thing together, but not wanting to wanting to ensure that there's no other, types of negative outcomes for us having that between us. So yeah, so just, I want you to keep these behaviors in mind as we go through some of this, because I'll come back to it and explain, why this can be very confusing and why this area of literature and development of prevention efforts is really challenging. So in terms of grooming characteristics, it honestly presents as very normal behavior. It is very hard to detect. And, some people might say, "Oh, I'd rather be wrong than to miss something." And so they might jump to conclusions about behavior, but we don't want to live in a world of fear either. And we don't want to pass it on to kids, because there are so many amazing qualities about children having relationships with adults in their lives, especially caring ones and safe ones, of course. And we don't want children or even parents to assume that every adult that takes an interest in their child is looking to groom them or behave negatively or harshly with them, because a lot of times it is very innocent. But that's why I think that we have to recognize that it's not necessarily one behavior, it's a pattern of behaviors. And there's a lot of points for us to kind of look at that in terms of, what are some of the things that kind of take place together? What are the pieces of the pattern that we should be looking at? Again, as I was saying that grooming is usually used as, something that takes place before actual abuse, but not necessarily. Sometimes the abuse will happen without any of the grooming. And usually that's, more related to if it's convenient, if it's something where they don't have the time or they don't have the repeat access to a child, grooming behaviors don't really become as possible if they don't have that concentrated private time with the children, or again, with the people around the child. And then again, in terms of the way that a groomer might come across, I mean, they're doing everything they can to hide their intentions. And so a lot of times they will come across as incredibly kind and charming. They want to, be your child's, a part of their support network. Sometimes they want to be their best friend. It might seem so sweet and so innocent and perhaps too good to be true. But, again, it's about the intentions. So the behavior doesn't always reflect what the intentions might be, unfortunately. The other thing is that within the online realm, there's this concept of disinhibition where people feel braver and they feel like they can hide their intentions better when they're online. It also can cause them to feel a lot braver, and they might end up doing things online that and doing and saying things online that they would never have the guts to do in person. So this creates some challenges as well in terms of identifying this behavior, but also, within the online realm, trying to find these people because they have the ability to hide their identity. It becomes very challenging to actually catch them and to, take subsequent action. So within the literature, there are two main, there's lots of different categories, I should say, of groomers or grooming behavior, but there's two main kind of categories in terms of, what the groomers hope to get out of these situations. So there are what are called the contact-driven groomers. These are the people who really want to get access, the physical access to the children. So they're more likely to, engage in different types of behaviors. And also their grooming behavior is often related to other problematic acts as well, in terms of, downloading child pornography, for an example, or, having a sexual fixation in a lot of ways. I didn't find, and maybe it's because I wasn't specifically looking at it, but I hadn't come across anything in terms of, is somebody who is more likely to be contact driven, does that mean they're technically a pedophile? That's a whole other area of literature that I haven't really dived into, but I suspect there are some potential correlations there as well. And then there's fantasy-driven groomers. These are the individuals that don't necessarily want to act physically on their behaviors, but they might still get some kind of pleasure out of getting the children to do different things. And these individuals are very likely to use online means to connect with the children, whereas contact-driven groomers, they might start online or move it into an online realm at some point, but they definitely need to have access, like physical access to the children. Whereas the fantasy-driven ones, they're okay with it being more within that fantasy realm. And again, this creates some problems in terms of, actually holding these individuals accountable for their behavior. So a contact-driven groomer, I mean, if they're physically within the, if they're physically in the same space as the children, you can identify them much easier. Whereas somebody who's operating more so in the online realm and more of that fantasy-driven, you might not have very much luck finding them, unless you use some of the other tactics, in terms of, cyber technology to catch people, especially if they are downloading pornography, then you'd have a much better chance of catching them. But again, because people can hide their identity, they can cover up their IP addresses and all that, it does create a lot of challenges for the professionals to catch them. So thinking about grooming, there's also some different subtypes that are outlined within the literature. So one of them is related to kind of self-grooming. So this is where the perpetrators or the potential perpetrators, they really try to, for themselves and maybe even for other people as well, is they really try to justify what they've done. And they also will deny what they've done as well. And especially because that behavior, that they might have engaged in with the kids, it's not necessarily a direct correlation of like, they're not necessarily doing anything bad. you know, especially if they're, you know, just giving a child a gift, for example. They could say, oh, I'm just being nice. What's wrong with being nice? You know, and so there's a lot of easy excuses and easy cover-ups for them to employ if somebody was ever to accuse them of, you know, ill intentions towards a child. I had noted before that grooming could also be directed towards the environment that a child is in or the people that are around the child, so the other adults. And this is a way to kind of gain, you know, or you want access to this group to kind of gain trust and to kind of fly under the radar as well. So if a groomer is, you know, or a potential sex offender is well aware that, you know, the people in the community see them as a person that they can trust and rely on, and they would never suspect them of doing anything bad, then that individual can fly under the radar, sometimes for years, decades even. And then the third type is grooming the child very directly. And so there are lots of different ways that this might take place. One of them is definitely building special relationships aimed with, you know, or with the aim of building a lot of trust and making that child feel very special and important to them. And this might involve giving them special attention or gifts, and also might involve engaging with them in activities that they really like. And, you know, to children that maybe don't have that kind of special attention or those types of relationships in their lives, that groomer might end up being a very important person to them, which can complicate all of this, especially, I don't know if I would say it's necessarily a situation. Now I'm kind of forgetting. There's that concept of when a victim falls in love with their captor. You know, there's a little bit of that element that can take place within these situations as well. So even the child, you know, even if so perhaps they've been taught, maybe they've been shown, you know, behaviors to watch out for with certain adults, but it can become very complicated for them when suddenly they have these additional feelings. Oh, Stockholm syndrome. Yes, thank you. That's what I was thinking of. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so, you know, and especially for, depending on the child's age, depending on their, you know, interests in having a romantic relationship, sometimes a groomer might make the child feel as if, oh my goodness, this is my first love. This is my first romantic love. So that's definitely something that, again, can complicate all of this. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted you to kind of get a sense of what's out there within the research literature as well. So there's different models or theories of grooming, and essentially these are ideas about what behaviors are going to occur within a grooming process and what order they occur in as well. So generally, you know, they all share the same kind of ideas of, you know, making sure that they select somebody, they select a child, they select a context, they select a community that feels safe to the groomer, that feels, you know, like it's a place where they have opportunity and they have access to different children, and they want access generally to a very particular type of child or types of children. So I'll definitely outline some of those characteristics as we go forward. But yeah, often they want to first scan and select, and then once they're in with the community, or if they've already been involved with the community, they want to, you know, make sure that they find a child that's going to lead them to success. And success is defined by access to the child, the secrecy, and then potentially even abuse towards them. But they are very particular because they don't want to be caught, right? So a lot of their decisions go back to that. They go back to, okay, what is risky and what's less risky behavior for me to engage in, and ultimately for them to get what they want to. But yeah, so once they actually have access to the child, then they generally will engage in, you know, more innocuous behaviors because they don't want to scare anybody right away. So they try to fly under the radar and try to do very, you know, normal things with the children. And then afterwards, it might escalate a little bit more. And as I said, the grooming doesn't always lead to abuse. So it might just escalate and then perhaps die off, or maybe they get caught in some way and then they back away before they can actually engage in any kind of physical abuse with the children. But sometimes that abuse it doesn't necessarily have to be physical abuse, especially if they are online with a child. They might engage in different types of behaviors with them using webcams, or, exposing them to different types of pornography. So just because it's not physical abuse doesn't mean it's not abusive and potentially harmful to the child. And another part of this is about, actually, I don't know if any of you have seen the documentaries on Michael Jackson. Those were really, as I was going through this literature, I couldn't help but think back to that documentary in terms of, really exposing how these children were groomed, right? So there were a lot of like the classic telltale signs of grooming that were taking place within that context. And again, it's a celebrity, but that celebrity identification for that individual was of benefit to them. It allowed them to get away with a lot more behaviors than perhaps the average individual. So that was what was really, harmful and alarming about all of that situation. But again, it's, it takes place in other situations as well. It doesn't have to be just within the realm of celebrities. Yeah, so I think that's what I'll say about that. In terms of, and again, coming back to more strategies that they might employ, or more specific ones, again, comes back to accessibility. And in terms of why, somebody might have access to children, well, think about it. There's so many different roles that adults can take that result in them having very regular contact with children. And sometimes they might just be in helping or caring roles. Sometimes they might be in positions of authority as well. And generally they need to be in a position where the children can, and the people around the children can begin to trust them so that they don't suspect anything. Yeah, definitely they might try to entice, so by bringing children gifts or giving them amazing experiences. So if a child really wants to go to the zoo, that might be something that a groomer will take them to do if they, are able to have that kind of access to them. Definitely at some point, and again, it's hard to say when this might take place. It might occur very, very early on, but it might occur more gradually, where the relationship will turn from being very caring and friendly and very, innocuous and seemingly, not a problem, to suddenly introducing sexual elements to the relationship. So it might be, just trying to help kids understand what different elements of sexuality might be. It might be, suggesting that they engage in different behaviors or have fantasy discussions as well. There might also be exposure to pornography. And as I was saying, if they're in an online realm, there might be the use of a webcam or maybe even picture sharing. Yeah, and then in some cases there might be use of alcohol and substance use, and this can be a way to kind of entice. So again, for some kids, they might be like, oh yeah, this is a cool experience, I'm getting, this adult is treating me not like a little kid. They're treating me like somebody who is more adult-like, and they're giving me access to alcohol and substances. So those could be gifts or experiences that individuals will provide to youth, and again, to kind of make them feel special and make them feel like they're, having these little secrets together. But that secret, or those secrets, and especially if it involves, behavior that a child isn't supposed to be engaging in, like, drinking alcohol or taking substances, sometimes those experiences can be used or blackmailed, or the children can be blackmailed for engaging in those behaviors. And again, it kind of can really grow that secrecy and that feeling of being isolated from others, because suddenly, well, I can't tell mom and dad that I was engaging in this behavior with that person because I'll get in trouble for drinking the alcohol. And they don't often think about, oh, that person's going to get in trouble. Even though the groomer might say that, they might use that, oh, you don't want to get me in trouble, right? You don't want our relationship to be torn, you don't want us to be torn apart and our relationship to be damaged or dissolved by your parents. So make sure you don't tell them that I did this for you. So that's a very, possible outcome as well in terms of engaging in that behavior. So coming back to, more of the strategies, this is a really interesting one because this is often taught within the realm of social psychology, which is actually my background. And these principles are used in so many other facets of our world. When we're trying to persuade people into doing something or to engage with a certain group or activity, we often will rely on one or more of these principles of persuasion in order to, convince somebody to do something. And so these are absolutely strategies that are used by groomers as well. And again, it kind of relates to some of what I've already talked about, but it allows you to kind of understand, some of the breadth of what they can do. And also this is a part of our basic psychology. So they're using our basic psychology against us in a lot of ways. So, so the strategies are reciprocity. So this is really where they might make a child feel obligated to give back after they've been given something. So if they've been given a gift or an experience, right? A groomer might come back and say, oh, you owe me now. In terms of commitment and consistency, as a strategy. So they really want to be, the groomer needs to ensure that they're consistent and they have integrity across all the commitments. So as not to, raise any alarms. Often groomers will be in a position of authority and they will use that to their advantage as well. They will use it in terms of, gaining access, but also building trust, because a lot of times there's this presumed idea that, oh, if you're a person of authority, if you've gotten to that level, you should be trustworthy. Social proof is another strategy. And so this is really relying on other people in their actions to guide what you're doing. There's scarcity where they might give access to children, something that they don't always get, and really helps them, see that person who provides that rare thing or activity as, oh, that's somebody I want in my life because they're giving me access to something that I can't get easily on my own. And then in terms of liking, so a lot of times, generally we prefer the people that we're closest to or that we know the best. And so groomers will use that to their advantage by making sure that that child feels like they really know them. And also the groomer wants the child to feel like, I really know you too. We know each other very well. We are close. We are good friends. And the groomer might also say that they have, whether it's true or not, they might say they have a lot of similar interests as the children, as a means to connect, but also to make the child feel more comfortable, because they, then think, oh, this person is so much like me. And so then it leads them to feeling like they are safe for them to interact with. So again, coming back to this, what types of behaviors would we potentially see a groomer engage in, and what are some potential warning signs? I mean, I've outlined the list here for you of like various more concrete specific acts that you might see. But if we come back to that original list that I gave you about what do we often do with children, what are some of the ways that we engage with them, you'll see that some of these, it's a fine line between whether or not they could be seen as appropriate or inappropriate. So, and I think that no one behavior is indicative of the larger set of intentions behind that adult's interest in the child. But definitely if you were seeing, a series of these behaviors take place, this is where spidey senses can potentially start going off. Even just one behavior might, kind of make you think, maybe I should watch out here a little bit. But again, it's sometimes can seem so innocent. So, and we don't want to jump to conclusions and automatically accuse people in our lives of having ill intentions towards the children around us. But I would suspect if we saw multiple of these or multiple behaviors like these taking place within one relationship, that would send alarm bells for me personally, but not just one. So I want to Again, I was talking to Jasmine about this before. It's hard because I want people to understand what's going on here, but I also don't want to send off too many alarm bells and for everybody to walk around in our lives thinking everybody's a potential predator, right? That's not a way that I personally would like to live in the world, but I do think that people need to balance with what are the realities as well. So if there's actually, and this is very similar to my approach to sex education as well. Like I try not to do too many fear-based kind of messages, but also just, providing people the facts, providing people the information about what our reality is, right? And the reality is that these behaviors, I mean, they're not easy for us to all of a sudden see and then for sure accurately detect, oh, this is happening. That means that this person is wanting to harm my child. Definitely doesn't always go that way. So in terms of identifying who's at risk, what types of children, what types of environments are at risk, the number one thing that came out was vulnerability. And children can be vulnerable for a variety of reasons. So if they are not getting the attention and the affection that they so crave, because as humans, we all want to feel loved. So if a child isn't getting that from the immediate adults in their lives, they might seek it elsewhere. Children who've been traumatized early on in their lives, again, might be related to this need for affection and this need for comfort and support. But it can also be related to, different types of cognitive processes for them. So maybe they are not able to recognize different behaviors, and potentially unsafe or concerning behaviors of adults. Children that are marginalized and victimized in other ways. So this might be marginalization based on socioeconomic status, could also be culture, race, ethnicity, can definitely be sexual orientation as well, and disability. And then the other group that, it can generally be seen as vulnerable are those kids who might be isolated from their peers, and they might even be bullied as well. Other risk factors. So again, if there's a situation where somebody has a position of trust or authority with a child, if the child doesn't have a lot of safe adults in their lives that they can turn to and kind of recognize, oh, this is the difference between a safe and a maybe not so safe adult for me. And so this might relate to not having really great relationships with parents or extended family as well. If families are troubled in different ways where they're not really close or together, if they have low socioeconomic status, or if there's alcohol or substance abuse as well. There's also some interesting points about coming back to socioeconomic status. So even though that might mean that a child is more vulnerable, a lot of times for online behavior, it takes place within a place of privilege, right? So having access to a smartphone, having access to a tablet or a computer and the internet, those are privileged notions. I know that because it's so pervasive within our worlds, we probably take it for granted, but it absolutely is a marker of privilege. And so in cases of online grooming, it actually isn't about low socioeconomic status. It's more about people who have access to that technology, and that can put them at greater risk for that reason. So within the literature, I know a lot of times people want to know based on sex or gender differences. So again, a lot of the literature is operating within the gender binary or the sex binary as well. And we see that a lot of times girls are reportedly victimized more than boys, but we also know that boys are less likely to report. And that's generally because they feel stigma related to that happening to them. So take that with a grain of salt. I think that in a lot of ways, they're probably both more equally at risk. I don't think it generally pertains to one or the other more so. But again, the literature is very unclear. And again, we have this social issue that complicates things as well. And same with age. So the literature on, is it younger or older youth that are more likely to be groomed? It's very mixed. So I can't give you a definitive answer for that. And I also have to caution that with all of this literature that I have gone through, it was very correlational in nature. It wasn't causal. And that was the nature of the research that's been conducted. There are limits to what we can answer, and whether I really don't know if we can determine causality in an ethical way with a lot of this. So it's very correlational in nature. So I need that to be said so that you understand how far or how much to take with or to run with this information. And again, I think the best way to kind of look at it is tendencies, right? So not definitive, but just tendencies is a way for me to usually rectify that issue. So hopefully you have your own strategy for that as well. Different personality variables can put youth at risk as well. And again, I'll caution with the correlation versus causation kind of elements to this research. But, again, linking back to, a lot of these behaviors or these circumstances can co-occur. So if a child is from, has a minority status, if they are bullied, if they are of a low SES, that might mean, or if they've been traumatized, right? If they've had physical, sexual, or emotional abuse growing up, or some kind of accident, again, it could lead to other types of personality variables that then put them at greater risk as well. So things to look out for, but again, the literature isn't, we're not looking, we're not going out there and saying like, okay, yes, if you've been traumatized, you're definitely going to be a victim. If you have low self-esteem, you're definitely going to be a victim. It doesn't work that way, but the constellation of things. So if you see that there are children that have a lot of these qualities all together, so again, we're looking at patterns, that might be a place to, or a point to determine, okay, like, should we be concerned? Is this the place for intervention? But I would caution with going on just one variable. I really encourage everybody to look at a constellation of variables before acting on behaviors. Another kind of area that was pretty prevalent, and again, this came out, it'll probably take place more within those more privileged people or privileged groups, so the people who have access to an online realm very regularly, but groups that have, frequent social media use, and if they're engaging in sexting behavior with other people, those youth might be at risk of being groomed as well, or connecting with groomers. So if you want to read more about kind of that social media sexting kind of behavior and potential consequences with that, highly recommend other reports that I created for the Prevention Institute. So they are available online. I believe Jasmine will probably put the link in if she hasn't already for you to access those, but these two documents go into much more depth about that very specific context of being online and using social media. So I would say one of the biggest, why do we care about this topic? It's ultimately because of the consequences or the potential consequences. So, there might be some youth that are groomed, and, if the grooming doesn't lead to abuse or any kind of exploitation, it might not affect them at all. But then there might be those cases where the grooming does lead to abuse and exploitation, and they could be negatively affected in lots of different ways. So I didn't go through, my literature wasn't focusing on, specifically the abuse and the exploitation. It really was focused on the precursor to those. But there are times where, depending on the individual, depending on the reaction of the adults around them, depending on if the behavior, once it's found out, is, actually stops, some individuals can be very negatively affected by this. So their mental health and well-being can definitely take a negative turn. It can lead to issues with just general sleep and concentration, anxiety and depression rates can go up. Some people might even experience, PTSD and all the symptoms that go with that. Guilt and shame, just understanding the power of guilt and shame is so important, because If somebody thinks that they've done something bad or that they are a bad person because of engaging in this behavior, I would say the number one thing to tell victims of grooming is that this is not your fault. And it's the same thing that I say to people who've been abused, whether it's physically, emotionally, or sexually. You are not to blame. You've done nothing wrong, you know, and especially in the case of grooming, everything that a groomer does is with this intention of, manipulating and with making you question your reality in a lot of ways and make you think everything is one way when really it's actually, quite bad on the other side. Other ways that this can affect, being groomed can affect children. It can really affect their, various elements of their image, like their self-image, so their body image, their self-esteem as well. And it might also lead to them having trouble trusting people afterwards. So whether that's other adults in their lives, or maybe, if they end up trying to pursue romantic relationships with people their own age, it might lead to concerns and lack of trust. And also, not just being able to trust other people, but they might have trouble trusting themselves and their own ability to decipher, is this person safe for me to be around? All of that can come into question for these youth. So in terms of understanding, what it looks like for, from a youth perspective, there's some really great literature that does highlight that and really focuses on, individuals who have been groomed or individuals who know somebody who's been groomed. But the biggest thing is that for a lot of youth, and it's not their fault, it's really the groomer, because again, they're engaging in behaviors that make them feel this way. But, the youth might not recognize anything is wrong. They might think it's completely fine. It's completely normal. It's so similar to other, adult relationships that they have in their lives, or it's similar to the relationships that they have with their peers as well. So everything could fly under the radar for them. I was saying before, they might have more complicated feelings towards the groomers. So they might come to really love that person. They might be very sexually attracted to them as well. They might believe that everything was consensual. They might try to convince everybody, I knew what was going on, or I was okay with everything that was going on. I don't see what's the problem here. And it might be very difficult for them to later come to terms with what really happened. Some might never get there. They might never get to a point where they recognize what was happening to them was not okay, especially if they stay within that place of being very, attracted to the person and very connected to them, or very much in love with them, for example. And it might be hard for them to admit that they were gullible or manipulated into those situations. And again, if they think it's consensual, they're not going to see it as a forced situation. They're not going to feel like they were, forced to go into any of those circumstances with that person. They might look at it as, I was an autonomous human being who made that choice. And to help them understand that that's not quite what took place, because again, those people use very manipulative strategies to make a person feel like it was their decision. And finally, if an individual, if it comes out that there was this grooming type of relationship, a family or any of this adults that are around the child, their reactions can potentially make it a good experience where they're like, okay, good, I feel safe and supported. I feel like, I'm going to continue to have that safety and that support going forward. But if a family turns around and decides to blame a child, or decides to completely make it about themselves rather than focusing on how they can help the child, those can all compound, the feeling that a child might have about the whole experience. So definitely something to keep in mind. If you ever find out that your child or somebody has been in this type of circumstance, just be very mindful of how you're coming across to them and making sure that you're not making them feel like it is their fault or that you don't care about them. So lots of different points or potential points of prevention or intervention. Really the current, and again, it's kind of the nature of the issue, because the way that our legislation or our laws are set up, somebody really has to do something physical. So they have to actually abuse or, do something that's within a realm of, or the zone of having proof, right? And evidence that they did it. And if, if a person's just talking to a child, if they're just, behaving quote unquote normally with them, what can you charge them with, right? So again, it's the nature of the act, but it's also the nature of our current legislation. So perhaps there are ways that we can revise the current legislation, but how to do it in a way that is meaningful, I'm not really sure. And again, that's not my area, but people whose area that is, yeah, let's talk. And there's different points that we can kind of intervene generally as well. So we might intervene when we realize that, hey, a person has interest in children, and very specifically has sexual interest in them. So that may be an individual who identifies as a pedophile, for example. We can also, if a person is engaging in more of that self-grooming where they're trying to justify to themselves that their behavior is okay, that's another place that you can intervene. If a person is engaging with the close people around the child, if they're, kind of inserting themselves into an environment, that's another place. And then of course, once they start grooming the child, and again, whether or not we can determine that's taking place, challenging, but if we are able to find that out, that's a place to intervene. And then finally, we can also intervene once that, once the behavior has occurred. So afterwards, and again, the type of intervention that we might engage in might look very differently, but as I've kind of outlined, hopefully you can recognize there are some very easy behaviors that we can engage in. So again, I gave the example of, after a child is groomed, ensuring that they know this isn't your fault. And other ways that we can, really act in a preventative or intervention focused kind of way is really to increase our knowledge of what grooming is. So all of you who've come to this webinar today or are watching it later, the first thing we have to do is understand, what is this? What is it in its entirety? Understanding what are the myths, what are the stereotypes, and what's more the reality of the situation as well. We can go through different intervention or detection training kind of protocols as well. So really, if there's different programs available, I didn't come across a lot, but I see that as a place for, maybe there is places for an online course to be developed or infographics to be developed to help people understand what they can actually do or what they should be looking out for. And what I thought was really, really great is to get knowledge from the people who've engaged in that behavior. And I know for some people that might seem appalling, but honestly, there are a lot of individuals who have engaged in this behavior and have been reformed, and they have had lots of, treatment, and they have overcome their desires and their, behavior and changed their behaviors. And they are the ones who have that inside knowledge. They know the websites, they know the forums, they know the strategies and the tactics. They might even know some of the people, that are engaging in that behavior. So honestly, they can provide so much information. And especially if they are dedicated to, bettering their lives and not behaving, in these ways going forward, having them involved in those types of interventions can be very meaningful for them and ensure that they don't necessarily continue engaging in that behavior, because they see, they can see that, there are positive things that can come from their experiences. So within the literature, what I found, and again, it was less plentiful than I might have liked in a lot of ways, but I think that there were some key takeaways in terms of, types of behavior that we can engage in. So some of those might include, telling or avoiding descriptions of the issue that only, or I guess it's more combating some of the stereotypes. So a lot of times people think that, oh yeah, this is only really young children. Well, it's not. So helping people understand that there's a wide breadth. So I showed you that information before about the literature is not clear on whether it's younger or older that are more likely to be victimized. So it's really all of them are potentially at risk. the behavior, because grooming isn't always something that's physical, tangible, it's not always violent necessarily, helping people understand that you can't just look for those behaviors and say, oh, I found grooming or a case of grooming here. You have to understand that it's more nuanced than that. The other key thing is there's a stereotype of grooming being completed by strangers to the children. And unfortunately, that's not the case. It can be people that are close to the children, people who have access to them is really the big key takeaway there. So combating some of those stereotypes and really spreading more accurate descriptions of what the issue and what the context is can really be helpful and help us combat this issue. Education about why engaging in sexual behaviors with minors is wrong. Yeah, huge. Because a lot of times people might not get it. I know it seems like common sense, but unfortunately there are those people out there that haven't been taught that. Of course, avoiding any victim blaming and fear-based messaging as best as possible. I know, again, we're all human, and you know, fear is natural, but we want to make sure that our messaging doesn't come across in a way that creates guilt or shame in the individuals. Of course, if we're, you know, providing any information, need to make sure that it is very appropriate for our audience. So if we're engaging with parents, if we're engaging with educators, or we're engaging with youth, we're not going to necessarily give the same you know, information to them, or we might give the same information, but we might not present it in the exact same way. Want to make sure it's very age or developmentally appropriate. And, you know, really making this a part of school curricula, huge, you know, because that is a place where you have access to the most amount of children. And so you have the most amount of audience, right? And people who are willing to hear this information, and they can share that with their caregivers as well. And now, if you've looked at some of the sexting kind of resources that have been developed for the Prevention Institute, you'll know some of the risky online behavior that you should maybe watch out for as well. And there's lots of different types of cybersecurity programming that can be used in helping with that. So if you see, you know, if you want to limit what your children have access to online, that could be a really effective tool for making sure that they don't stumble upon, you know, perhaps a forum or a person who is involved with the forum, you know, and tries to lure them in different ways. And probably my favorite kind of strategy is talking to kids very directly, very much in a developmentally appropriate way, of course, but just talking to them about the realities of, you know, different types of adults in their lives and relationships in their lives and online behaviors that they might engage in as well. So yeah, that, I mean, youth don't want to feel necessarily like they are being talked about. They really do enjoy being talked with. And I know that's hard. I know that sometimes, depending on what age they are, they don't want to talk to you. But if you're not the person for them, try to find them somebody that they trust, that can give them this information, and it's not just going to fall on, you know, ears that are, you know, not open to what is being said, because, you know, there's a lot at stake here. And in terms of school-based interventions, yeah, there's tons that, you know, different educators, but different, you know, schools, so the school board or just the full school itself. There's lots of different policies that can take place, because again, we see that a lot of groomers, they try to gain access, you know, so sometimes that does mean, you know, schools can be a great point of access for them. And not that you need to necessarily assume all people involved with schools are to be you know, to be seen with suspicion, but there are ways that you can be very preventative in terms of, you know, the way that you screen people, the way that you hire people, the way that you engage with people as they're working, and you know, looking at what types of access that they have to children, and what types of behaviors they're engaging in with children. So coming back to that, you want to look for patterns. You don't want to just look for one-offs in terms of the behavior. Yeah, and then just general additional tips that I might give coming from the literature. So accessing and making use of different cyber safety kind of websites, educating parents and caregivers and children about all of that as well. So that might mean providing safety lessons in schools, having conversations with children about it. You might need to monitor, depending on the age of your child, you might really have to engage in that monitoring practice to see who they're talking to and what kind of conversations they're having with them. And then helping children understand what are markers of good and bad relationships with adults, what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, helping them understand what is normal and expected and what is a little bit unexpected or abnormal. And then generally just helping kids understand what are healthy relationships, whether that's friendships, whether that's romantic relationships. Right now I'm working on another literature review on youth dating violence. And within that, I will be highlighting, those markers of healthy relationships. And I think that that is really essential for children to understand, whether it's, with people, with their peers, but also with adults as well. So yeah, definitely, I would highly recommend these two resources because it outlines a lot of the online related tips that would be really helpful. And because we know that, a lot of these grooming behaviors seems to be occurring more so online, really, really helpful. So yeah, that's all I got today. And I just went over an hour, or maybe I was just within an hour, but got lots of time for questions. Really, really looking forward to hearing what you all think and want to know more about.
Thank you so much. That was great. I think we do have a few questions. I'll just pull them up here. Can a groomer ever just decide to stop being a groomer?
Of course, of course. And I mean, me saying that, I have read some around some of the literature around people who have attraction to children that way. And yes, they can be reformed. Absolutely. That's a whole other area. And I don't necessarily want to go into all of that today, but I do believe that there are individuals, but it's not easy. It's not all of a sudden that they can just turn it off, right? Sometimes they do need intervention. So that intervention might be some kind of educational intervention, programming, therapy, massive amounts of therapy can definitely help people too. Biggest kind of things that are targeted are those feelings of guilt and shame. Guilt and shame, they're just such complex emotions or experiences for people that can lead them to engaging in really horrible behaviors a lot of the time, right? So if they feel like they're not worthy, nobody cares about them, whatever, that can lead to all types of really negative behaviors. So I think combating the shame and the guilt, really key points within those interventions. But yeah, I don't know how spontaneous, like all of a sudden they just wake up one day. They might stop if they realize how dangerous it's getting. Like, so say if they were just kind of dipping their toes in and they realize like, oh, no, I can't risk these consequences, right? Like I can't risk losing my job, for example, just because I want to engage in these behaviors. So yeah, that might lead somebody to just flat out stopping that behavior.
Okay, and another question. Is it the case that many of the statistics emerge after the youth in question become adults, or at least sometime after things took place?
No, not necessarily. I know what you mean, because like sometimes it might have occurred and they might not have told anybody when it was occurring and when they were young, and they might bring it up later. I didn't find that within the literature. There were all points where that information was coming out, so it was occurring, because I think I had noted in one slide there was the different points of intervention, and those are all places where it could be found out and where those stats can be garnered from. So I would say it's kind of across the board. It can happen when they're, or generally can happen when they're young and right as it's happening or just shortly after. But yeah, of course, there are going to be cases where it comes out later, but I didn't see that was more prominent than the other.
There was also a question about types of supports available for groomers. You did already touch on that. I'm not sure if you have anything to add.
The supports for the people that are grooming, yeah, it's not my area, but there are. I mean, I know there's quite a lot of my colleagues within the Department of Psychology at the University of Saskatchewan. Quite a few of them are looking at different interventions for people who have attraction to children and are engaging in those types of behaviors. So, I mean, yeah, therapy is a big one, but I'd say there's room for more. Like I know it's a hard topic though. I've definitely, some people are of the opinion that we should just put all of those people on an island, you know, and then others have like a more, what I would call humanistic perspective of it, which is that they're humans who are doing inappropriate things, and, you know, there's a belief that they are able to be reformed. But, you know, in terms of the success of reforming them, I'm not very well versed on that specifically, but I am hopeful, because to me, intervening at that point is such an important component, because those are, again, the groomers and the subsequent offenders, they have that inside knowledge, right? Like they know. There's a lot of people who, you know, engage in different forums, and there's books that are written about how to groom, you know, and you want to know about that, because if you're trying to combat something like that, you need to have the inside scoop. You need to know exactly what you're battling against. So I would say that those individuals can be, you know, allies in this. But again, I'm not telling you have to engage with them. I know that that is a whole complicated matter for a lot of people. I've had very heated debates, you know, with people about whether or not we should see them as human and see them as potential sources of help and intervention and support. But yeah, that's my complicated response.
Is there a high number of groomers who were groomed themselves as youth or children?
Yeah, and again, we'd have to go to the more like sex offender literature for some of that, because we don't have a ton of information on the groomers unless they have become offenders, right? Because the grooming itself, the way that our legislation is, the way that the behavior is, they don't always get caught, and they don't always have interventions for them, right? It's not like they're being caught as groomers and going to therapy. Like that's very rare. They usually have to do something to get caught, and that something usually has to be a very, you know, tangible abuse. And then of course we know the way the system is, that doesn't always end up with them going to therapy or going to jail or anything like that. But in those cases where they do, yeah, there's tons of, you know, there's usually automatic therapy that they have to go to, or group therapy that they have to complete as well. The success rates of those, that's a little bit out of my scope. But again, I'd be hopeful, because if we can turn that around, we can save a lot of children. Because a lot of the people who are offenders are often repeat offenders, and we don't want that, you know. And it's not like we have a ton of offenders. We have a couple of offenders that are abusing lots of people, right? So at least statistically and at a population level.
There's also a question in the in the Q&A tab, and I'm not entirely sure how to interpret it, asking about the pandemic and isolation and how youth could be protected during this vulnerable time.
It's too early in this literature to know about pandemic related, but I would say definitely check out the sexting resources that I mentioned, because I think those apply whether we have a pandemic or not, right? Because yeah, I definitely understand what you mean, like that increased isolation, the more time spent online. Yeah, potentially that puts people more at risk, but I don't know if it's any more than pre-pandemic or post-pandemic. So I can't say specifically, but great question.
Yeah, time will tell, like many of the pandemic things.
I know.
I don't see any other questions, but maybe, I'm interested in your opinion about the connection between grooming behaviors and online misogynistic content directed towards young men about dating. I feel like a lot of the advice constitutes grooming. Any thoughts about teaching teens about this in the context of grooming and healthy relationships?
Oh man, that immediately makes me think about this book called The Game. I read it years ago. It's by Neil Strauss. Neil Strauss, he was part of this group. He's reformed, but he was part of this group of, kind of what you're describing here, these very entitled, misogynistic kind of behaviors, because that they would engage in to solicit dates, to kind of get women, right? And I remember being so angry the whole time I was reading the book, right? But he had written it kind of like after he was reformed, and he was really trying to help people become aware of this existing, right? A lot of people feel, and this also kind of relates to some of the incel kind of research, which we also have from the University of Saskatchewan. We have an individual who does research on incels. I think they're actually located in the UK now. They're working, but they are still connected to the university. So I might connect the Prevention Institute with him to kind of get more info on that. But I would also say stay tuned, because the resource that I'm working on right now relates to youth dating violence, but also the contrast of that, what are some more healthy behaviors that they can engage in with, when they're dating or when they're actually in relationships as well. But yeah, in terms of that overall connection, I didn't see that within the literature for this specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of correlation between that grooming behavior and that misogyny. But that misogyny also implies that it's very directed towards women. And we saw that within the literature, it's not necessarily 100% young females are more targeted. That's just what's reported. We know that young boys are also targeted. They're just not necessarily reporting. So there might actually be very comparable rates of girls and boys being victimized. So I don't know, that complicates it, right? To kind of look at it as being a misogynistic thing as well, but really interesting and getting me thinking quite a lot. So thank you for that question. Welcome.
A lot of thank yous. So informative. Further up, someone shared their experience and said that having been groomed in the past, they felt things that you mentioned were very accurate, and they definitely saw people trying to intervene as bad guys. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I remember when I was growing up, I remember hearing about one of my stepsisters being groomed online, and she was convinced, she had everybody in the whole family convinced that she was going to run away with this person and marry them, and we all had to caution her because we didn't know this person. All we knew was that she met them online and she was very young. I think she was, she was like 17, I think. So kind of on that cusp. And she was just, yeah, nobody could say anything to her because that person, that groomer had done such a number. They had done such a good job. And I hate to say that, but they had done such a good job at grooming her to the point where she was isolated. Nothing anybody could say could get through to her. And the only reason why she was able to get away from that person was because when they met, I hate this, but when they met, the person didn't think that she looked young enough for them. And so they ended up breaking up with her. So it's just, it's wild how it can all unfold. And in a lot of ways, I'm like, relief, that she wasn't hurt. But then we were dealing, as I was saying earlier, that she was in love with that person, or so she was convinced. So she was so heartbroken, right? And there was no consoling her, right? Nobody understood. So yeah, that isolation tactic is very sadly effective. Oh, I see another comment. Oh, people. Oh yeah. Oh. That is, yeah. See, this is an example where, yeah, a lot of times the grooming, we're mostly focused on it being with young people because the idea is that young people need our adult help. But yeah, we don't consider the older people, who could be groomed as well. And sometimes they're being groomed for lots of reasons. Financial reasons is very prominent, right? Trying to convince older people to give you money, or to give you their life savings. Yeah. And yeah, that is very much a huge area as well. I think it definitely Yeah, it probably goes beyond the scope of the Prevention Institute because they're very focused on youth, you know, but not to say that that isn't a very important issue and one that definitely connects to this as well. I would suspect it's very similar behaviors, right? Just because it's, you know, an older person doesn't mean that they don't engage in, oh, it was about youth. Oh, I see. How well we're educating old people. Oh, I guess, sorry, I misunderstood them. Okay. Got you. Okay, now I understand. So you're saying that they were grooming the environment and the adults around them. I misunderstood that. So my apologies. Yeah, no, it definitely is something where, you know, you can't just intervene in that one-to-one relationship. You have to intervene often with the whole community, right? All the people that are around the children, especially if that person, you know, the groomer has like infiltrated into the whole family or into the community. They're all potentially being groomed. So yes, you've identified, you know, an example, or you've brought up an example where, you know, they have, you know, used other people around them to kind of, again, isolate children more, or to gain more trust, or to have more access to them. And yeah, so everything is vulnerable, you know, all the contexts, all the people. Yeah, it can definitely take place that way. And then, you know, not only are you dealing with like the children feeling gaslit and confused, but all of a sudden you have like all of these adults who are like, what just happened here? You know, and I'd say the ultimate feeling is probably betrayal, and like that feeling of like, wow, like the world is unfair, the world is not just. Who can you trust? I'm sure all those feelings and thoughts come to mind. You feel very disillusioned. You're just like, what's up, what's down, nothing makes sense. You know, so I think that that's, you know, again, while a lot of this literature was focused on youth, I absolutely believe that it all applies to those individuals who are adults who were groomed in the process as well.
Is there any last minute questions? I don't see anything popping up. All right, well, thank you again, Lindsay, for this presentation and sharing your knowledge with us today. In a follow-up email, you'll be provided a recording of today's webinar and the additional links that were shared in the chat. When you close this window, you'll be directed to a link where you can complete a short survey evaluation for this session. Completing these evaluations helps us create programming and resources that support you in your work. We really appreciate you taking the time to provide feedback. Thank you all for joining us today. See you.
Thanks, everyone.